Hello, I'm Finola from RaaS, and today our focus is on specialty alloy powder manufacturer Amaero International, ASX ticker 3DA. Joining me to discuss progress of its flagship Tennessee operation is Chairman and CEO Hank Holland, Executive Director and Chief Technology Officer Eric Bono, and Chief Financial Officer and Chief Administration Officer Chris Scanlon. Welcome, Hank, Eric, and Chris, and thank you for joining me.
Thank you. Thank you.
Now, Hank, you're fresh from the annual general meeting, and it'd be great to hear your take on what we're seeing in the US at the moment. There are a number of reports that the US government sees additive manufacturing as a game changer for parts for use in hypersonic weaponry. And to that end, US Defence has developed the Gamma H initiative to drive new technologies. What opportunities do you see for Amaero in this landscape?
Thanks, Finola. Thanks for your continued interest in the company. I think what it's really indicative of is a couple thematic backdrops. One of which is, given the stress in the supply chain, additive manufacturing plays an important part, right? It gives us more real-time production in the supply chain. It reduces waste of material, which is important in this day of scarcity of material. And then moreover, of course, as it relates to defense landscape, we live in, unfortunately, geopolitically uncertain times. We've seen this with the escalation, not only in Ukraine, but more recently in Israel. And also, for the very first time since 1957, the U.S. has ceded a primacy capability to another superpower, as you mentioned, that being hypersonics. Mm-hmm. So there's enormous interest and focus in the Department of Defense today, as well as the first-tier defense primes in the U.S., to complete the development stage of hypersonic platforms and to advance those to the commercialization stage. One of the challenges that we have right now, and this was highlighted by a report commissioned by the U.S. Air Force, U.S. Air and Space Force in May of this year on the vulnerabilities of supply chain, are critical materials, notably refractory metals that are used in hypersonics. This has created a real interesting opportunity for Amaero, particularly as it relates to CO13 powder that we've announced we will dedicate the first atomizer to produce.
Eric, there are existing manufacturers of C103 niobium powder in the US. What are some of the demand signals that you're seeing in the industry? And do other manufacturers have the capacity to produce C103 powder?
Yeah, so I think that's maybe two separate questions, right? So the demand signal, not trivial, right? These are often highly classified, top secret programs, which we don't have access to. So we base our knowledge on feedback that we are getting directly from the labs. So think Air Force Research Lab, Oak Ridge National Lab, NASA. Places like that is how we are putting together our demand side signal, at least in the hypersonics. The industries like space, a little more direct. We can talk directly to the customers. But that's where our demands are coming from. We've recently signed an agreement, I think maybe Hank will probably hit on it later, with a company that has some secret clearance that will be able to get us a little more definitive demand numbers for the upcoming years. And your second question was kind of other producers of powder, of C103 powder. There's not a lot, so you need very specialized equipment because by their nature, refractories melt at a very high temperature. Most atomizers are built and designed to melt inside a crucible. Well, you can't find a crucible that has a temperature range for refractories. So that cuts out a vast majority of suppliers. The ones the few that are left that can provide refractories, it's a bit of a side business for them. So powder itself is a side business for these large companies, couple percent of their total revenue. Refractory powders within that couple percent is a couple percent. So I think what the industry and the Department of Defense is really looking for is a company that is focused on satisfying this need, and that's what we are. And that's why Hank was able to announce that we are dedicating our first atomizer to C103.
Hank, perhaps you could talk about the classified nature of hypersonic development and the commercialization path that you're on. How are you estimating demand and planning production?
Yeah, thanks, Finola. And again, you follow the company closely. I think what you know over the past years, we've made a real concerted effort, not to announce commercial agreements that aren't definite. be it MOUs, LOIs, whatever the case may be. B, to give what we feel is prudent and conservative advice and guidance going forward. Moreover, of course, we're limited from the ASX of announcing things where we don't yet have binding commercial contracts, offtake agreements, etc. So for both internal purposes of planning our production schedule, as well as client and investor facing purposes of disseminating information that's reliable, we've engaged a company called Fairmont Consulting. Fairmont Consulting is considered one of the top consulting firms in the U.S. that's focused on the defense industry. As Eric mentioned, they do have top secret clearance. Now, that being said, I want to be careful to give appropriate guidance. That does not suggest that in our report they will be able to disseminate and describe information that's obtained in that theater. They will not, right? And we obviously do not have, nor does the audience have that clearance. What they will be able to do, though, is go out to defense primes, go out to DoD, go out to the labs, get a sense of the underlying projects that are progressing from the development stage to commercialization stage, and the expectation of appropriations. Within those projects, which components are suitable for 3D printing? Within those components, which components need refractory metal for high temperature environment? And then discern this would be the expected totality of demand for C103. There too, it would never be the case that we would be a single supplier. Right, all of these primes, the nature of it is they need dual suppliers. What we're trying to do, and the real opportunity we have, is become the supplier of choice, have a first mover advantage, and moreover work closely with the labs to develop property characterization and powder characterization, which would later be used and qualify in other suppliers. So where we hope to be able to come back to you, other analysts and investors early next year, call it January, is with a third-party report that will have confirmed demand signals from their perspective, pricing signals from their perspective, and then in turn we can give that guidance. I will tell you that for internal purposes at least, we're being quite conservative. We've announced the first IGA or atomizer dedicated to C103. To give you a sense, at full capacity, which is 200 tons a year of powder we've announced, that would be 3 shifts of production. A single shift of production at C103 is approximately 100 million Australian of revenue, right? So we haven't given more guidance. We haven't given guidance as far as the price of C103, albeit yourself and other analysts have found that in the marketplace. But I think the way to think of it is a single shift, which is 1/3, again, capacity. It's about 100 million Australian revenue. As you can then see, it materially advances and accelerates our period of getting to free cash flow positive, as well as establishing a business with fairly significant revenue.
Eric and Chris, you both recently joined Amaero as part of the company's new US-based team to drive sales and development. Eric, perhaps you could talk about some of the upcoming milestones we can expect to see play out.
Yeah, so I kind of think of it in different buckets, the first being the facility and equipment. So we have a 9,300 square meter facility in beautiful Tennessee. The sort of floor plan design is done at this point. We're just starting fit out with a initial concentration, as you can imagine, on the production areas so that we can start to make powder. That will be done or being started over the next month to allow our first atomizer, which is in the States through customs, to be started to install. I think we said April. We'll probably start it a little earlier than that, and we hope to be making powder end of June, early July, this upcoming year. So that's sort of the equipment side of it. On the commercial side of it, there's I would say two sides, right? There's us buying our feedstock, and then there's us selling our powder. On us buying our feedstock, we are lining up long-term agreements right now for bar, which is what our feedstock is. On the selling side of the commercial world, we are, I'll say, in deep discussions with several significant end users, and expect to have our first offtake in Q1 next year for C103, with more announcements coming after that. And then I think maybe the third bucket is quality. So we will have ISO 9001, AS 9100 qualification, our internal work done by Q3-ish of next year, and hope to have the official audit and qualification certification done by the end of next calendar year.
And I would add, Finola, the capability is considered so strategic. Obviously, what we care about is, at the end of the day, earnings, profitability, revenue. Ironically, from a private investor standpoint in the U.S., from a strategic investor standpoint in the U.S., as we sit here this time next year, and we will have finished the fit out of the facility, finish the commission of the equipment, receive the quality certs, begun qualification of material, et cetera, even at that point, having a turnkey facility will have created significant value. And it's one of the things that we'll begin to look at in the lexicon of strategic options from a capital market standpoint, right? ASX is absolutely the right place for us to be today. And over time, as we look at, what's the value the ASX investors attach to our business versus what's the value that private investors and or strategic investors in the U.S., as we hit these milestones, would attach to the business.
Well, Hank, that's a nice segue into my final question. You have already flagged at the AGM that you will need to raise capital to develop operations and provide some working capital. How do we expect to see that play out? And to that end, do US investors have an appetite for advanced materials opportunities such as Amaero offers?
Yeah, important question. So the benefit of finding the facility in the US that was completed, it accelerated our time to market. It reduced the risk associated with the build-to-suit site. It reduced our working capital significantly, about $22 million. As we talked about at the annual general meeting, the expectation is, from a Australian standpoint, both OPEX and CAPEX, we will need to raise, or we will have a need of about $60 million of capital to get to be free cash flow positive in calendar year 25. $60 million capital, total OPEX, total CAPEX. Obviously, as the largest shareholder at 39%, we're very, very mindful of dilution. And so where I'm working closely with Chris in his capacity as CFO, and where we've been meeting with a lot of investors here in Australia this week, is what's the most appropriate way to sequence that capital raise over time to make sure we maintain a strong balance sheet. We've got adequate capital for growth initiatives, at the very same time do so in such a way that minimizes dilution. I would expect that we will go to market with a relatively small capital raise, maybe $10 million Australian thereabout. I would expect that we will add a small amount of corporate debt to our balance sheet to round that out. And then I would expect sometime in the first half of next year, April-ish, as we've hit some of these milestones, we would go back to the market for a more significant capital raise, likely with anchor investors in the U.S. at that time, that would essentially fully fund our OPEX and CAPEX needs. So one of the interesting things about the Amaero opportunity, and this is a challenge, as you know, in mining opportunities or other industrial opportunities, is it sets in motion a perpetual path of having to raise capital. In our case, by this time next year, we will have fully funded our OPEX and CAPEX needs. And I think that will be an interesting thing that differentiates the opportunity as well.
Well, thank you, Hank, Eric, and Chris, for joining me today. I'm looking forward to catching up with you over the next 12 months to check on Amaero's progress.